My name is John Egan. I work here in the Center for Teaching and Learning Technology. My role is I'm the Senior Manager for Strategic Curriculum Services, or as I like to call it, other duties as required. So I work on a range of different projects here in the center, and I've also worked here at UBC in various roles. I also lecture in the Faculty of Education, and I've worked as an instructional designer. So one of these people that came here once and has just never managed to leave. So what I'm going to talk about in this session is I'm going to talk a bit about things that we're doing at the unit level here in the Center for Teaching and Learning Technology in terms of trying to foster more scholarship of teaching and learning. I'm also going to have us work on a couple of activities about how to nurture a scholarship of teaching and learning idea, because we get a fair amount of feedback who say that we want to research something but that people don't know how to get that research process started. And paradoxically, people that are strong researchers in their specific subjects or disciplines find the transfer to scholarship around teaching and learning a challenge. So you won't leave today with the ability to flesh out a fully formed ISoTL or CTAL project as we call them, but you should have a clear sense on how you can get your own off the ground and how you can actually interact with your colleagues to help them formulate their ideas a little bit better and hopefully have a bit of fun. And that J is supposed to be a smiley, but my iPad apparently didn't know what it was. So a bit about the Center for Teaching and Learning Technology. For folks who might not be familiar with, we're actually a new service unit here at the university. We're just coming up on our one-year anniversary. And the center was the amalgamation of three other previous service units. The Center for Teaching and Academic Growth, which provided a range of supports and professional development for staff, students, and faculty in terms of improving the teaching and learning culture here at UBC. And then the Office of Learning Technology, who also had a fairly comprehensive brief in terms of professional development, but at the same time also did a great deal of work in terms of managing and developing distance and blended learning on campus, particularly distance courses at the undergraduate level. But the third unit that a lot of people don't know is part of that merger is what was called CTAL Studios, which we now call CTL Studios. And TELA does not stand for television, it stands for Technology Enhanced Learning Environment. And so the task of TELA Studios, and now that it's called CTLT Studios, is to produce and support video and multimedia production that enhances teaching and learning. And that can be producing movies or videos. It can also be supporting things like video conferencing. So we've got a pretty comprehensive service unit. As one of my colleagues described to me, it's not 1 + 1 + 3, it's 1 + 1 is 5. By working as one larger unit, we actually are finding a lot of efficiencies. We're finding a lot of ways to not combine and reduce programs, but combine and expand them. And unlike other amalgamations, our amalgamation actually has resulted in a net staff gain. So the expectations of our unit are high, but one of the landmarks of all of the legacy units is all of us like a challenge. We like moving forward and growing. So let's talk a bit about the scholarship of teaching and learning. So broadly writ, scholarship of teaching and learning, or SOTL, is about researching teaching and learning practice. It can be looking at the experience of a practitioner. That could be an instructor, an instructional designer, a teaching assistant. It could also be what's called outcome research, which is actually looking at the student experience and often student performance. What makes learning happen better? What efficiencies? Scholarship of teaching and learning can be empirical, in other words, the collection and purposeful collection and analysis of data. It can also be reflective practice, which is particularly true of practitioner research, which is a purposeful, extended inquiry into about what we do, how we do it, why we do it, and what happens when we try to do it differently. Or theoretical or conceptual literature. And a lot of folks here are probably familiar with, for example, the work Dan Pratt here at UBC on teaching perspectives, about teaching and learning for adults. That's an example of conceptual work. Another would be, if we go back a few decades, Piaget's work on constructivism. So when you hear people talk about constructivism and constructive learning, that actually goes back to a psychologist named Piaget, working with early children. So there's a range of these. Now, how many people could see work where they do landing on one of these types of research? Either research as a practitioner or research on outcomes? Okay, good. How many know specifically where they want it to land? Don't worry, I'm not going to ask you what it is. Okay, how many people want to figure that out? Sweet, and I have something to do with you, that's great. So, The reason I bring up this differentiation here between empirical, reflective, and theoretical is there is a lot of presumption for people, particularly if they don't have a social research background, is research is always a data collection and analysis endeavor. And in social science, and particularly in education, that's actually not often the case. There are a number of reasons for that. Not necessarily at the higher education level, although to some extent it happens here. When you're dealing with something that is considered a high stakes outcome, and generally formal education is considered something with a high stake outcome. If you're experimenting, or if you're using various research models, say for example a traditional quasi-experiment where you're teaching a subject one way with one group and another way with another group, one of the concerns that comes up immediately is, what if that new way you want to teach it doesn't work? This group has now not learned it. Now, in reality, that's not something that we have to concern ourselves with. We can mitigate that. But that's why if you, for example, ever go to look for the scholarship around your subject matter, you might find there's not very much empirical studies. Because there are lots of people that have concerns about doing what they would call experimental interventions when they have a sense that what they're doing already works reasonably well. What that leads to is probably in some respects the dominance of reflective practice research, because we are all empowered as educational professionals to reflect on our practice substantively and strategically, and to share our experience because it's our practice. And the theoretical conceptual work around teaching and learning, a lot of that actually comes as much from social sciences outside of education as it does for people who are actually trained as educational researchers or educationalists. A lot of it comes out of philosophy, a lot of it comes out of sociology, anthropology, and a lot of it comes out of psychology. So there's a number of reasons why we land more often here, often there, and not so often there. So here's the challenge that we face here in CTLT. CTLT has a reputation that we've inherited because of our legacy units of being a service unit that innovates and shares what it does quite openly. Those are two of our core values, innovation and sharing. We also take on a leadership role, not just within UBC, but also in Canada and the world, about how teaching and learning in higher education can be done well and can be done differently. And we have an incredible team who do incredible work. But there's a gap here, and the gap here on the slide is also purposeful. Getting that experience and expertise into scholarly literature is a huge gap to overcome. So, and what do you think is probably the #1 barrier to that happening? Sorry? Time. Time. Where do you find the time to do this when you're already, your 35-hour or 40-hour job is already stretched out to 45 or plus hours, right? So bandwidth, to use nerd talk. So this is where we're at. This is the dilemma that we have in the service unit right now. So I'm not here to tell you that we found the magic solution that's going to be on the slide 17, and you can all use it too, and we'll all be happily ever after. I think this is a tension that we're going to have to live with as a service unit and as a unit in a university forever. What we're doing is looking for ways to mitigate it and to maximize opportunities for scholarship. So that's the unit level stuff that I'd like to talk about. And please do jump in with questions or comments. So here's the current state of where we are in CTLT. We're already active in professional communities of practice. We have support and we take advantage of the ability for professional development to go to conferences, to liaise with colleagues, to actually deliver professional development opportunities within the university and outside the university. We have consultancies outside the university. We do all that stuff. We present at academic events, and we are very successful, like probably most of you here, at getting stuff into peer-reviewed conferences. But it's getting it up to the level of peer-reviewed publication where we seem to be hitting a ceiling. It's getting stuff into journals and in chapters in academic books and academic dictionaries, resources like that, that's the challenge for us. And probably our best understanding of what the issue is there's a corner of the desk mentality here at CTLT about scholarship of teaching and learning. It's like, yes, we want you to do scholarship, but it's not built into people's workloads. It's not timetabled as part of their job. It's good to know, it's good to have as opposed to need to have. And that's what we're trying to shift here. And probably the same challenge that many of you will face, we're not going to get extra bodies to hire to redistribute the work that will need to be done if we make this part of our workload. So that's the challenge that we are facing. So this is the process that we're working through in CTLT, and we'll drill down a bit into it in a moment. But part of it is about determining what the capacity is within the unit right now to do research of the sort that we want to do. What is our research capacity? How can we engage our unit staff to have an opportunity to express an interest in scholarship? Because one of the assumptions also is that good scholarship always comes from people with a strong self-initiative. And actually, some people that aren't quite so assertive might have the ability and some insight into scholarship that isn't being leveraged because no one's asked them. So how do you engage your staff to see this as an opportunity that they might want to pursue? How do you develop procedures for your unit so you can manage the scholarship process? Because you should manage it if it's part of your unit's workload. You need to think about how it gets operationalized at the unit level. How do you design studies? How do you resource scholarship? How do you actually operationalize the study if there's a data collection and analysis, empirical study? And then what are your dissemination options? And how do you make the determinations about that? So, thoughts?
I had a question back when you went to, there was the gap and then migrating the best practices and lessons learned to the literature. Of course, you're going to have all sorts of discussions over what is the literature these days.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
You know, are we all aiming to be publishing books? Probably not anymore. Right? And how do we then ensure that we're getting to the academic credibility level and it's being accepted as such if we move into the media?
It's a legitimate tension, absolutely. One of the things that personally motivates me in terms of my scholarship of teaching and learning is when I can't find something in the literature, but I know someone else is doing it, that makes me say, well, if I'm doing something that someone else could benefit, I want to get it in the literature so they don't have the same dilemma I do, right? So there's academic currency about things like publishing in journals. There's also human capital in terms of your community of practice. If we are producing stuff that supports our colleagues to do better work, they will in turn do that for us. So, but you're right. You're absolutely right. There's a big tension between open access journals and journals that you have to subscribe to. But in things like distance learning, it's actually shifting where the open access journals are getting more prestige than the ones that continue to hold on to the paper journal model. So, but if you work in a discipline that uses impact algorithms to determine how valuable a publication is based on how many times other people cite it, you need to be mindful of that. You can't just say, I'm going to write a great paper, and if no one ever reads it, it's still a great paper. Yes, but if your discipline says, we want to know who's citing your work, you should bring that into your processes in terms of decide where you decide to send things. So, that sort of, but it's a much longer conversation than that, yeah. So, any other, Marion?
Well, just kind of related to that, we've had this discussion before, is if you do this kind of research, do you target your disciplinary journal? Like if I do stuff in pharmacy, do I go for the pharmacy education journal? Or do I go for the more general CTAL literature, get it into ISoTL? And so that's another tension.
Absolutely.
It's like, who's really the audience that you're looking for?
Yeah. I had a discussion with some colleagues a few months ago where someone found a journal that was perfect for the paper they were writing. It was a brand new journal, though. So do you go for the perfect journal that not many people are reading yet? Or for another journal that might take it or might not, but has a much broader circulation? Those are the sorts of decisions you make. If people are new in terms of submitting to peer-reviewed publications, or maybe for CTAL type work, one of the things that I suggest people look at is turnaround time. Because if you're going to get rejected in a month, that's better than getting rejected in 9 if you've got another journal to send it to. So, as some of us have learned through pain, I had a 16-month wait once for a rejection. Yeah, like, couldn't you just shred it, right? So, those are great. Any other questions or comments? Okay. So in determining unit research capacity, that's where I am, right? Who in your unit has postgraduate research training. Now, why would postgraduate research training be important in terms of research capacity?
We won't waste so much time guessing about what are the key things that you have to go through.
Absolutely. What else?
So related, I guess, methodological expertise.
Yeah. That's what I meant to
That's kind of what
say.
it is.
Absolutely. At working in a university environment, why would a postgraduate credential be useful?
It's credential.
Right. Is there a hierarchy of credentials in a university environment? Absolutely. I've not come across any research project at UBC that are driven by someone with a bachelor's degree. I've come by a fair amount, surprisingly, that are driven by people with master's degrees, and lots with people who have doctorates. So the credential matters. And so the postgraduate research training is a pretty important thing. It shouldn't be difficult for most units at UBC to have at least one person who has that. Now, does it need to be in education? It better not, right? Absolutely. If you have someone who's got educational research training, that's awesome. But you know, it's also not a requirement. So one of the perversities of having a PhD is, to some extent, you're an expert on everything if you want to be, until someone asks you if you actually have had any training in it. There are lots of people that are teaching and doing research in a field that is completely different than they did their doctoral work in. Completely different. Some of the best educational researchers in the world have no pedagogical training in their graduate studies. So, but having said that, after identifying who has some postgraduate research training, it's identifying what are the specific research experiences that your staff have already. So how many people have done graduate theses, doctoral, masters? How many have published in scholarly circles or presented at conferences? Get a strong sense of what you have on the ground already, because you want to build on the capacity you have rather than try to start from nothing. If you start from nothing, one of the negatives of that is people who have experience and expertise can sometimes feel like they're a little shunned or not valued because you've just not bothered to find out that they're there. There are lots of people at UBC who put every credential they have on their business cards, and a surprising number of people who have doctorates who don't put it on their cards. So you can't go by what a website does either. So encourage a conversation within your unit to find out who has some of this training and find ways that you can then maximize that. So in units that have people that have training in social sciences, doing some in-house capacity building workshop type training on research methods is absolutely valid and absolutely appropriate. So the next capacity after having actual research training is, to what extent have people in your unit done any publishing in academic circles? And so what's an example of an academic publication of a type? Like literally, what's the formats that they come in?
Oh,
A journal, sure. What else?
E-journal.
E-journal, thesis,
Monograph.
monograph. Sorry.
Book.
A book. A book, sure. Anything else?
Is that the same as e-book?
A book, e-book. Everywhere a book. Old MacDonald had a book. Yeah, no, e-book, sure. You also have conference proceedings, where conferences actually publish the papers that people present. And those can be refereed or non-refereed. And they each have different levels of currency. But they also have different levels of skill required to do them. So getting an abstract submitted at a conference and presenting a talk around that abstract is a different level of writing for academic publication than getting stuff that's published in journals. So again, if you identify what the capacity is in your unit, you can then also look at ways in which you can broaden and expand that capacity. Build on what you have, so you need to inventory what you have. So, but also look for other people that have strong writing skills. How many people here have ever written a lecture or a course? How many people here have ever written part or all of a report? Who have ever written a very sensitive, where language is life or death, letter to somebody for work? Yeah. And you're all still here, so you did okay. those are all writing skills, and they all can be leveraged and built upon. So generally, from my experience, people who know how to communicate in the written form can learn how to adapt that ability for different purposes and different audiences. So, and particularly if you have people that have that experience writing for academic publication, already you have the capacity for buddying and mentoring, where people can work collaboratively on the writing piece, and the person who doesn't have a lot of academic writing process rather quickly gets up to speed in some of the norms and practices in scholarly writing within and across disciplines. So, but then there's also technical capacity. And so, particularly if you're doing empirical research, invariably there will be software required. If you're dealing with qualitative software data, what kind of software might you need? In vivo or Atlas. Does everyone know what those are? Would you like to share?
Well, I've used both just a little bit, but they have the capacity to, in vivo in particular, you can sort of import all kinds of different media. You can take transcripts of interviews, et cetera. I mean, that would be the most classic, I guess,
right.
A transcript of an interview. And what you're looking for is themes within, you know, what people have said. So there's ways of tagging things so that you can then, if you've got 20 different interviews, you know, what did they all say about learning in the classroom or whatever.
Right. That's a perfect description of what qualitative software does. The old school way of doing what's called coding used to be you made 25 copies of every interview you did, and you got your scissors out, and you wrote the initial of the person who the quote was from, and you put that in the pile about classroom. And then you found the ones that were about marking. And you did this in a room with the doors locked and the windows closed, because if someone comes in that door, and that's not a joke, happens all the time. Okay, my coding has been destroyed, you know. You don't want a place where your dog can come and run around, or your kids, right? So what qualitative software does is it digitizes that process. It allows you to put one copy of a document in, and the document can also be audio or video or a still image. It doesn't have to be text-based. And you can then code for themes and then output that code quite readily. And the nice thing about qualitative software is, probably when I deal with people whose training is quantitative, statistical, one of the first things they start to talk about is, well, how do I know this is not just one person's interpretation? How do I know this is reliable data? And one of the benefits of qualitative software is, if someone says to me, but did they talk about this? Instead of having to go through 15 or 20 or 100 interview transcripts, you can search for the word and the themes related to that word in all the transcripts in about a minute. And say, you're right, 3 people did. Or, no one talked about that. So it does bring a level of rigor into the process. It also is conceptually a bit challenging to get used to how the program works, but most qualitative researchers I know, once they get used to using software, can't imagine going back to not using it. It also allows you to collaborate. So if you were doing some coding of interviews, you can just send the whole thing to someone else and say, why don't you do it too, and let's see what we come up together. And that's called interrelated reliability. So that's an example of qualitative software. What would be an example of quantitative software? SPSS. SPSS. Anyone use any other ones?
We use Excel.
Yep. You have to be careful about some of the measures in Excel. Some of them are a bit off, like particularly the parametrics. Like I think it's the 2-sample t-test with large samples. Used to go a little bit wacky. Yeah, there's another one that a lot of scientists use called SAS, and it's command-driven rather than menu-driven. The nice thing about SPSS, which is now it's called PassW, because IBM bought it, and I like to give things different names, is it allows you to pick different statistical tests through menus. So you don't need to have to type in commands, you just need to pick your parameters, pick your variables, select subtests or validity tests, click a button, and it'll push not just the output, it'll also give you some pretty reasonable figures if you want to use tables or pie charts. The pie charts are ugly. So, in terms of hardware though, if you're going to be doing interviews or observations of classrooms, you need to have a way to capture that data. So you need to have audio or visual capture tools. Now the great thing is, particularly video, the cost of a decent video camera has plummeted. You can get a reasonable quality, high definition video camera that records onto SD cards, which means that you never run out of capacity. You can get one for less than $400 now on sale. That same camera 5 years ago would be $2,000 to $3,000. So the opportunity costs related to doing that sort of work have come down. Digital audio recorders are even less expensive. But there's another hardware expense when you're doing interviews and you're recording them and you want to actually have the full interview, which is you need to transcribe them. Now, has anyone here ever transcribed an interview? How was that experience?
I'm looking, but I do recall I used Dragon Naturally Speaking, a voice recognition software, and then never tried it myself, but.
What about you, man?
Well, I was reviewing my own interview, so it didn't bother me too much. I did have lots of time. It was really interesting, but it was really labor-intensive.
Yeah.
Sure.
For a person who isn't a very skilled typist and doesn't have the right equipment, you're looking at 5 or 6 hours per 1 hour of interview. So if you interview 25 people for an hour, Merry Christmas.
I recently conducted a bit of a working study and presented on this. I got down to 1.9 to 1 instead of 5 to 1 or 4 to 1. That's not me, I'm not spectacular, but it was using voice-to-text transcription in a particular workflow. And it made a huge difference in my work, and I've then propagated that test out to some undergraduate students who did about 20 hours worth of interviews, and it really worked. So if I can help anybody with that, I'd love to pass it on, because qualitative transcription is a pain that we can do that.
Anybody else have experience with that they want to talk about?
I don't, but I have a question.
Sure.
Video.
Yeah.
How do you code video? I can see how you do audio, but the visual component.
There are a few different ways you can do it. What you can do is when you're using the coding software, what it does basically it creates a map of either a clip of the video or even a still from the video, and you basically tag the image. But it still is able to pull that text out. So yeah, it's cool. Yeah, it's cool. When I was doing my master's, the great lie of qualitative training is you get a better sense of your data by transcribing it. That's a lie.
You just want to get it done.
You can't afford to pay someone is what it is.
Yeah.
When you get your transcripts done by someone else, you can take all that energy into actually making sure the transcript is right, reviewing it and listening to the tape. Because a good transcriptionist gets 90%. That still saves you 180% of the work because you can't do it as quickly. But a good transcriptionist also needs the right hardware. And as we've moved to digital audio recording, what's happening now is the old school pedal commands that you would use a cassette player don't work. You can get some for computers, but they don't always work across systems. Like most of them work for Windows applications, some of them work on Macs, some of them don't. So there are different hardware implications. But those are the sorts of things, if you're going to do a fair amount of qualitative research, it might be worth investing in 1 or 2 transcription setups because it will save you time because you can do some of these things in-house. Okay, so who can do what? What do we need in terms of tools to actually do the work? And now here comes fostering engagement. Now, has anybody here talked to a researcher about a good research idea and got it shot down? Or a good idea ever? What does it feel like if you go to pitch an idea to someone and they basically shoot it down?
Well, it obviously doesn't feel good, but then you have to stand back and say, well, why did they shoot it down? I mean, is it something from their perspective, or was it really not such a good idea after all? Or what did you not do? What didn't you do in thinking through your idea?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I would propose, though, it's actually better when people come with you an idea to say, that's really interesting, and then help them refine it better. So that's what I'm talking about when I say foster a level of engagement. So what you want to do is, instead of screening out ideas for research, you want to screen them in. You want to encourage, at least initially, even things that you don't quite get the significance of, and try to help the person refine those ideas. Because often, there's a diamond in that lump of coal. And if there isn't, they might find the diamond because it's a slightly different study. But screen in, encourage people to feel like it's an open environment to talk about these things. You need to manage time effectively, so you can't just sit around for 12 hours a day listening to research ideas. But work on shifting the perspective on, instead of problematizing and interrogating ideas, giving them a bit of nurturing and help develop a bit of focus early on. And you'll probably come up with some real gems. And some of the ideas that people have that are really quite good are remarkably low intensity in terms of implementing them. It might be a pilot study with 5 people. So you might be setting yourself up to produce quite a lot of stuff. We had a big discussion about this in CTLT when we started to talk about how we wanted to do more subtle work, and we started to get more interest. And the first reaction we had was, we need to set up a system. And very quickly after that, we said, no, we definitely don't want a system. And the reason why we didn't want a system is we didn't want to give people a sense from the outset that this is a hierarchical, administrative, or bureaucratic nightmare. We wanted to create a space where people felt encouraged to talk to us. There are a few of us that have research capacity that are positioned to have this, give people feedback. So focusing on informal interactions. When someone says, I'd like to talk to you about a research idea, say, great, let's go for coffee. Or yeah, come on in my office, or I'll come into your office. Really keep it low stress, low stakes, get people talking through ideas. And then instead of waiting for the person who had the idea to come to you with follow up with them. Demonstrate that you actually think their idea is worth pursuing. Because a lot of people, if they get to this phase, don't get to this stage on their own. A little bit of encouragement can be very, very, very worthwhile. Bring people together. So here in CTLT, we have an informal group that meets. We're not meeting in the summer because it's UBC in the summer, but we have a meeting about once a week where people who are working on scholarship ideas or actually are in the process of writing or presenting can bring their stuff to us and talk about what their work is. And sometimes they talk about the actual project or the data, but sometimes they talk about the process of actually doing the scholarship. And so it's very informal, it's collegial, it's forthright, so people see, if someone sees something they think is a glaring omission, it's better to hear that from your peers in a polite and low stress environment than at the conference with 500 people in the room. So it's designed to bring people together. We don't at this point do a lot of focused activity type stuff, although that's something we're considering. In other words, some more specifics about methodology training or data analysis training. And embedded in all of that is promoting a team approach because of that side of the desk mentality, a lot of people are working on these things in isolation. So by having a few of us that are sounding boards, if someone talks to me, if Lucas has an idea and Luisa has an idea and I see some intersection there, I can actually, all three of us, we could have a conversation. And even if they do their separate projects, they now have someone that they can share that road with a bit. So these sorts of things in terms of fostering engagement are really effective. Lucas.
I was just thinking and it's a little context specific, but at CTLT there's quite a few people who are publishing in informal new media. Mm-hmm. And how do you work to try to bring them into CTAL or not?
That's a great question. I have an answer, but what do other people think?
An example would be someone who's been blogging for 15 years, has a huge blog following, does write about education. So how can they be brought into CTAL rather than in that area, or should they be?
But it doesn't really matter how it's out there, right? So in a sense, the only problem is that if you're in a blog or a wiki type of thing, it's so ongoing, and where is the academic integrity? But nonetheless, the thoughts are there, so the medium doesn't actually matter. I don't think until you want to come to the end result, and then there's that discussion. Mm-hmm. But if you want this discussion, why wouldn't they be?
Mary?
Well, I mean, to me, one of the issues is formulating a research question that those data would help satisfy. And that's often way more difficult than it sounds, is to come up with the appropriate research question. But to me, that's the change in thinking from, your scholarly activity, turning that into scholarship.
I guess it would really depend why you're doing it. Is you're doing it just because you want to vent your ideas and you want to get some feedback, informal feedback, or you really want to think it through. And to me, as scholarly, if I want to publish something on a journal, then I would probably put a little additional care. Not that I guess because I will need to find out what the literature is saying, for example. So it's not just out of my hat, but I will need to look at what if other people have said something around that. So it would be, so how would I bring somebody is actually through a conversation asking this person, why are you doing it? And what is really the reason for? Is it just because you want to share your thoughts, or you want some informal feedback, or you're actually looking to bring it to a different level, and therefore do the research that is necessary to find out who else is doing it and how they're doing it and how you're doing it differently, and start really comparing yourself, your research with other people. So I would approach that person to say, okay, now what do we want out of this?
There's a few really good pieces there. So one of them I would, it's a great opportunity, is don't drag someone to do something they don't want to do.
Sure.
However, if someone who doesn't want to do this can contribute to it, find a way to make it user-friendly for them to do so. So one of the things I actually do quite often is, I think I might know who one of those people you're talking about is, Lucas, ask if I can chat with them and record it. Transcribe their ideas, see if it captures, ask them to go over the transcript. Does this capture it? This is what I was thinking of doing this, what do you think? So you can use other tools to leverage it in a way so people can still work naturalistically. And nobody at UBC loses points on their career if their name is on a publication and ends up in a journal. Everybody who is in a professional role here at UBC or in an academic role benefits from having publications, and your unit benefits from them. This is part of the currency of higher education. Some people are quite skeptical about that. I actually like the challenge of bringing the work that I think is important into that realm. That's the sense of achievement that I get from that, is broadening the literature in ways that it's not there now. It's challenging, but it's really rewarding for me. So the literature actually is very purposeful for me, and I have a very personal passion about it. Because when I was that person looking for the literature and couldn't find it, I was extremely frustrated and even disillusioned. And I'd like to think that I'm making a small contribution so that fewer people are so disillusioned. So a bit limited on time, so I'm going to move forward if that's okay. So let's talk about how you manage scholarship within your unit. Our unit's rather large and complex, so I'm not going to go through examples here. But one thing you might want to think about is what sort of topics are appropriate for your unit. Even if you're in an academic unit and you teach in certain areas, what areas do you think are ones that come to mind as where this scholarship can happen sooner or easier rather than later? Where does the scholarship ideas, as they come up, where do they align within what the unit's work is? You should be able to see an alignment. It doesn't always have to be a linear alignment. The overlap doesn't always have to be perfect. It can be quite almost ancillary, but you should be able to make those connections to every scholarship piece that you support in your unit. Who and what sort of approvals do you need within your unit? And I want to be very clear about something. Approvals is not version of papers. It's not appropriate for your boss to be vetting your papers. They can decide whether or not your name is attached to UBC or your unit when it's published. So important to get those things up front with people. So there's some latitude in that. So I do, outside of UBC, I do a fair amount of community-based research. None of those publications list that I work at UBC. None of them have anything to do with what I do at UBC. I'm a person. I don't lose my personhood by being here at UBC. But if the unit wants to, the unit should be thinking about where stuff fits in the unit's workload. And the approvals isn't usually about the content of the research. It's about we can only do so much, and which projects do we prioritize over others. But people should be aware of that. Like right now, because this is early days for CTLT, it's not an issue. But if we can maximize 15% of the capacity in this unit that we have right now, we could be overwhelmed with projects. We have that much we have over 60 staff, right? So, academic partners. Any research that you're going to do that involves talking to people or getting people to fill out questionnaires, human subjects, needs to have someone with an academic appointment to be the principal investigator at UBC. Whether there's money for it, as long as the methodology involves getting people to share their experience or stories, you need to have an academic principal investigator. So I have a PhD, I am a staff person. I cannot be the PI on a program at UBC. I can be the co-investigator, but I cannot be the PI. It's important to know that, because if your unit doesn't have anybody who has an academic appointment, like in our unit, we have an academic director. And so as our projects start to move forward, our academic director, who is pro tem, will have to make some decisions on which projects they can support as a principal investigator and which ones they can't, because they also can't put 78 proposals through in 1 year. The Research Ethics Board will go, wow, maybe we should send you to rehab because obviously you don't sleep. So identifying other academic partners that you might be able to work with is pretty important. So now anybody who's already teaching in a subject who has a teaching appointment or a tenure track teaching or research appointment at UBC can be a PI. So if you know, and you actually don't need a PhD. But if you need to have that sort of partnership, you should identify that up front. And for a lot of us, it's not a question of doing one piece of scholarship. It's you have a range of ones that you could be involved with. So knowing people who you can talk to about those projects when you need to have a PI is going to save you some time when you actually want to get the project off the ground. And that leads into the conversation about behavioral research and ethics. UBC subscribes to what's called the Tri-Council system of research ethics involving human subjects. The language is the language of ethics. I don't choose it, but it's the language, so I'm going to use it. You need to get your studies approved for ethics if it involves talking to people. So having someone who knows how to do that, because it's kind of like filling out your taxes or going through customs, answer the question they ask. Don't give them information that's not part of the question, because they might stop you for 5 months because they say they're concerned about it. So I'll give an example. My PhD thesis was on drug injection in the downtown east side, HIV prevention. So my questionnaire was full of stuff about sex and drugs, and they only queried how I spelled principal and principal investigation because I had a very good supervisor. So other people, they would get the things that people get knocked back on is if they're talking about something that's considered controversial or might be high stress, do you have a mechanism for helping people get support with that? That shouldn't come up in scholarship, but that's the kind of thing that delays an ethics approval.
John, a couple of quick questions.
Sure.
The first one is that, so you need BREP only if you are actually citing the name.
If you're collecting data from people, you need BREP.
Even if you don't mention their names.
Absolutely.
Okay.
In fact, you usually don't mention names.
And the second thing, though, that I heard is that if you use your own students, there was some, Shane Dawson told me that there is a way of, if you're using data from your own students collecting for your own course, you actually don't need to apply for, you don't, okay, there was
not true.
something,
That's
okay,
not
no,
true. That's not true.
I'm sure he said the right thing, but I probably not remembering correctly.
Referring to Brett makes a distinction between that kind of work that you do for improving your own practice.
Yeah.
Versus
actually presenting it as research and disseminating
Yeah,
it.
that's right.
And that's the thing that makes the difference.
That's
there.
right.
If you plan to disseminate it in any way publicly, it needs to go through Brett.
That's
if
right.
it's simply for quality improvement in your course.
Oh, so if you don't publish at all.
That's
if
right.
you don't, yeah,
Well,
that's right.
and for example,
yeah.
and one of the very common types of educational research is called action research, is researching one's own practice. You can talk about everything you do in that classroom, and you don't need approval. You talk about what one student does in the class, and you needed approval.
Oh, I see what you mean. Okay.
Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Did you have something you wanted to ask?
It was similar.
Okay.
Basically, it's the loophole about improvement.
There's certain action research guidelines that
Yeah, there are.
people
So this is the thumbnail study design that I use when I'm working with people who come to me, they have a scholarship piece. And I call it sentence, page, proposal, and then review. So what do you think sentence is? If I say to you, I want, the first stage of this process is called sentence. What do you think I'm going to ask you to do?
Distill your idea.
Into
One
one sentence. Okay. What do you think page is? Expand that idea into a one-pager. And then what do you think proposal is? That's about right, actually. Develop a full first draft of a proposal, right? Can anyone see why the logic behind that approach? What do you see in that?
I like the simplicity of starting with a sentence, so you don't get cluttered with the proposal right away. You're really breaking it down to what you're planning.
No, exactly that. I mean, that one sentence is going to have to come back to you all the time. Are you sticking to what that sentence says?
You clarify your objective.
Yeah.
A big part of getting people off the ground is getting it out of their head, right? Get it on paper. Mind is a terrible place. It's an awesome place, but it's a terrible place. Now, this isn't called question. It's called sentence, and that's important too, because a lot of people find coming up with a research question really challenging and stressful. So don't tell me what your research question is. Tell me what your research is about. So, this is what I'd like you to do now. I'm assuming most, if not all of you, can come up with some sentence about an idea that you might do a scholarship piece on. So on the front of your paper where it says sentence activity, write a sentence. And then talk to your neighbor about it. Tell each other about your sentence. How was that? Tell me about that experience. Let's have a quick debrief. What did you get out of that?
It was useful.
In what ways?
Well, it was just interesting because we noticed that we framed our question in a way kind of a negative attitude, like what's wrong with this?
Right.
Whereas Louisa, hers was framed in a positive way. So how are we successful?
Right.
What are the success factors? Whereas we're looking at why isn't it working?
A deficit versus an asset approach.
Yeah.
Was it super difficult to get a sentence down? Was it?
Yeah.
Yeah, because I don't even know what I'm thinking.
But did you get the start of it? Like,
I got the
you're
start.
starting to get there? Like,
How?
normally when someone says this, when someone engage with this process, I don't say, you've got 5 minutes. First, I would have a conversation with the person, and I'd say, now, go see if you can get that down to like a sentence or two. But how many people got a little surprised at how far they did get? Any clarification? Like,
I thought our clarification was really useful.
yeah. And the feedback from someone else is very useful too, right? Right. So if you were doing this with me and you sent me your one sentence, what I wouldn't do with that one sentence is hyper wordsmith it, critique it. I'd look for the seed in it and focus on that, the asset approach that Louisa was talking about, right? And encouraging it, saying, this is interesting, let's talk about this. And from that, look at the opportunities to give it a bit more direction. So if there are parts of it that maybe are unclear or maybe even in rare cases problematic, the asset approach allows us to navigate away from them before people feel like they're being hyper-criticized. Does that make sense? So, but the sentence idea comes from one of my best friends proudly says that she grew up at a trailer park in Kamloops. And she got her PhD in CanLit here at UBC. And everything she did in graduate school, she did the MAMA test. If she couldn't explain it to her mother in one sentence, she couldn't explain it well enough. Her mother didn't have to think it was interesting, but she had to understand what she was talking about.
So 3-minute thesis.
Exactly, yeah, so 3 minutes is too long. Right, so, but by starting with one sentence, you're started. By getting it down in writing, you've started. In teaching and learning, often it's getting students started. That is the difficult part. But once they get started, things will move, right? Is that anyone's experience in education? It certainly is mine. So while you were doing yours, I thought, it's only fair that I do mine. And this is actually a study that I'd like to do. And so I teach an online course that teaches people how to create online courses, because if you can't teach that online, you're a complete poser, you're a hypocrite. But it's hard. So one of the things we do is we've introduced narrative into that course to underscore how you would use these technologies. So my sentence was, do the stories in my online course help students acquire skills better or faster? I'm pretty convinced they do. But I'd like to know that. I'd like to be able to say that. So I haven't identified methodology. I don't have a clear, concise research question. It's just an idea. Does this work? And does it work?
Do you always go for a yes/no answer?
No. No, I'm going to come to that in a sec. That's great.
Didn't you say it was supposed to be a sentence, not a
Yes,
question?
I did that.
But yes, that's why I didn't put the question mark. But I am a sociologist. What's wrong with answering a question with a question? Right? So, or the statement could be, the stories in my course help students acquire skills. Yeah. Right? But again, the wordsmithing isn't that important. You get a sense of what I'm talking about here, right? You could ask me questions to flesh the idea out from here, right? Just about not even talking about what kind of data, how you collect the data, just what's your interest? Where you think you're going to go? Where do you want to start from? And then we'll see where you're going to go and how you're going to get there. So the sentence is a really nice tool. Any other last comments on that activity? So, and if some occur to you afterwards, by all means, we can come back to them. So the next stage is the page. And really what the page is is a semi-formal draft proposal for a study. Really what you're doing is building on the sentence and fleshing it out a bit. So now, take a first crack at a research question. Tell me where this fits in our unit and what we do. What kind of data are you thinking about? What kind of literature do you want to know about, or do you know that is going to help you do this research? What's the timeline you think you want to do this in? And then, what do you need to do it aside from your wonderful self? So, the reason I don't call this a draft proposal is, I wish I could have had the camera on your faces when I said draft proposal. You know, a number of you, your countenance shifted when you heard the word proposal, like, oh, that sounds awesome. For a lot of people, it's a loaded word. If you're dealing with someone who hasn't done a lot of research or any research, they might feel the leap to here very daunting. They might even feel like, not yet, not yet, not yet, not yet. So just say, let's do a one-pager. We did a one sentence, now let's do a one-pager. So turn your paper over. I guess technically it's a two-pager because it's front and back. But so what I'd like you to do now is, in your pair or group that you're working in, just pick either of the, sorry about that slide there, sorry. Pick one of the ideas that you had, the sentence, and fill out as much of this as you can. And just do the ones that are easy, don't worry about all of it. And so if you think research question, not there yet, you could probably still tell us what kind of methods? A lot of people say what kind of things. And so in terms of methods, broadly speaking is, do you want to collect people's stories, or do you want specific answers to specific questions? Because if you want to collect people's stories, that's qualitative. If you want to ask very specific questions that are measures, that's usually quantitative. So most people at this point have an idea of what they would want to do. They may not use the language of research, but they still have an idea about it. So.
Where would action research fit in if that was my method?
It would be qualitative.
That would typically be qualitative.
Yeah. How is the page to do versus the sentence? Harder. A lot harder. Challenging.
But it's quite nice to have a group who you need to explain things to, who can help you put that in, rephrase or articulate it differently.
We're doing a really artificial process here. In reality, the way I would implement this is the sentence phase would go on longer. It would be iterative. It would be very low key, but it would be moving things along. Some people get the sentence right away and then start working on the one page. So what parts did people find most comfortable working on? You guys look, you did pretty well. I see some filled in spaces.
I think we had to really clarify. One of the confusions was around terminology and what do we mean by participant?
Right.
Because there's the people who are, in this case, it's looking at a program, and so the participants in that program, and this is X factors with them, and then who are you working with to do this research?
Right.
So we had to get that clear. And let's see, and then we were just starting to talk about the methods, and that gets really tricky, especially with this project.
But the nice thing about doing that at this phase is you're not worrying about whether it's using the constant comparative methods, whether it's an ethnography. It's like, what do I need from people to help me answer this question?
So I'm wondering if rather it's not methods but data sources, like where would you? And then we sort of.
It is methods because it's the beginning of methods, and one of the challenges is in social research is people start here and they don't do this part. Like they like what ethnography sounds like, so they design an ethnography, and then halfway through they realize they could have actually just interviewed these people. They didn't have to go watch them for 4 days each. So starting at the lower level, from my experience, actually makes the rest of it come together much more nicely. It also is a lot messier at the bottom because it's not like you're not asking very discrete, specific questions. So there are some people that are, as my PhD supervisor said, some people seem to have come out of the womb researchers. Some people just think research questions, think methodology, and you should embrace that and support people doing that. Like, that's great. But a lot of people, it's something much, much messier. So, and gauge people's, how many people's here's confidence of the process changed a little bit as you talked more about it?
Confidence.
Yeah, a little bit.
Yeah, right.
Like actually what it usually is usually it dips.
Yes, yes.
But then it starts to come back up again, right? And that's when you know when you're ready to move on or you're ready to say, okay, let's do another version of it, is when you hear the confidence bit, the dots are being connected again. Because the first time it's like, and you know, I've done lots of research, I've published lots, I still go, in this process, right? Just no one gives me this form, I have to go right to the proposal. But, so yeah, this is one of the things this sort of process does. And by the way, I don't even give people a form. I just say, tell me a bit of, in the email, I'd say, what kind of data do you think this would be? But the idea of this is, as daunting and complex and confusing this can be in one level, what you're also saying to people specifically or implicitly is, your idea is good. We're ready to structure it. And for someone who finds this really kind of discouraging, say, no, no, no. The reason this is difficult is because your idea is good. This is the difficult part of doing a research project. You've got the good idea. You're already ahead of 90% of them, which is true. A lot of ideas never get to this stage. A lot of stuff that gets past this stage isn't very good. It's not very interesting. It's no problem, you know, publishing banal social research and education if your methodology is solid. If there are places to publish. That's not a problem. But usually when you're dealing with this sort of things, people have a passion about it, but they don't have the disciplinary training to do it. They feel that's where you're dealing with the disconnect. So I have never created this forum before today, but I needed to facilitate a process with you folks. But these are the things that I discuss with people, and Louisa can attest to that because we've talked about some research. Like, say, where do you want this to go? And if someone says, I have no idea what the literature be, say, okay, who do you think, who can we talk to who might be able to help us with that? Because you're also identifying capacity, where capacity can be expanded, where capacity doesn't exist, and right now it's not a great time to spend doing it. All sorts of stuff comes out of this sort of process at this stage. What did anyone else's other experience on it? What about the experience was interesting or worth sharing to you?
I think that it's always the real challenge is moving from the huge generality of the one sentence statement to the much more specific research question. I mean, that first statement tends to be big, I think, and it can break itself up into all sorts of different research questions. And I perennially try to do too much.
Yeah.
Save the world.
Yeah.
I don't piece of it we really do this time.
Just
Save the world. Save the world from global warming.
Yeah.
Take my windows so the heat doesn't escape.
Yeah.
Right? That's a good analogy. Absolutely. So, anyone else?
It's remarkable how quickly just having a template can help to focus and move it to the ready stage. Just this time and conversation.
We talked a lot and I didn't write anything down, but I think I could now.
Yeah.
With a bit more time.
Yeah,
as a result of that.
And you know, a lot of people in these meetings, with everyone's consent, they record the meetings. You know, as long as you discuss when that's appropriate and what happens to those recordings, that's not a bad. I think if that helps your workflow, do that sort of thing, right? So, like I was talking to Greg the other day, they have these great LiveScribe notebooks that have a pen that records while you write. They're fantastic. If anyone can read your handwriting, no one can read mine. It's a nice thing to show people at meetings in case they can use it, but it's useless for me because I literally can't read my handwriting an hour after I wrote. And that's the writing, like my first grade teacher showed me how. So it's not a tool that's useful for me, but for other people, it's fantastic. So, but yeah, this is, like I said, we're doing an artificial version of what this process is like. When you get to the point where this is filled out reasonably well once, or you have this amount of information reasonably once, you can actually start writing a proposal. And what's great about when you cross that threshold is anybody who has ever written a successful research proposal that's been funded knows when a research proposal is good or bad, even if they're not situated in the discipline. They can spot the holes. And that's you might need to meet that same standard if you're not going for funding for this, but having someone who can do that for you and point out those holes is really useful. So when I've reviewed stuff for CIHR, I can review a grant on an area that's not my area based on the study design. Like they say they're going to be able to answer this question with this methods, with this number of participants, asking these questions. And I can say to a certain extent, methodologically, yes, that maps across, putting aside content expertise. Process-wise, this doesn't work. So even if the discipline thinks it's great, this methodology does not match what they say the study's about. Usually it's somewhere in between the two, right? So a good researcher can read a good research proposal and give some surprisingly good feedback on it, even if it's not their subject matter. In fact, most people I know that are going up for funding with CIHR and SSHRC now, if they have access to it, ask a peer who's not in their discipline to read their grant at a late version of it. Because if someone who is a researcher who understands research proposals can read it, and they might highlight things or things they don't understand because it's the discipline, but they can also say, how do you get from here to here? I have a friend who's a physiology prof. I torture him when I have to apply for grants because he has to read all this stuff about qualitative research and Foucault. It's fantastic. So, but it wasn't necessarily a fun activity, but was it a useful activity? But it's now 2:25. We started at 1:01. How far have we gone on these research ideas in an hour and a half? They've moved ahead from where they were, right? Is it a beautiful, tidy package that can go into the Christmas tree? No, probably not. But so multiply this by multiple interactions over a few weeks, sitting down for half an hour or an hour, several times over a few weeks, and keeping a record of what you do. You get a convergence really quickly. Already I could hear that some of you things were coming together in terms of the conversation. Consensuses and commonalities were being reached. It's not, probably the biggest challenge is giving people the confidence to go through the messy process. Okay, say a couple more things before we go. In terms of resourcing CTAL within our unit, we are still working on this. Building CTAL into workload. After the page stage, forming a research team. Because even if one person's going to largely drive and even conduct a study, we want them to have a team supporting them because it can be very tiring, and when you're in the trenches of stuff and it's confusing, finding someone who can support you can be challenging. Identifying at least a partner, ideally two people who can be their supports on a study, is really important. And in a unit like CTLT, it can't always be me. It can't always be Harry Hubble, who's our academic director. So identifying that capacity early on allows you to help put those teams together. So if you've got someone who's interested in doing research but doesn't feel like they're ready to do the one sentence, put them on a team. Largely to observe and to learn, but they also probably can contribute. And they might be able to do just some of the heavy lifting, right? So have the tools on hand. So one of the things we're looking at now in research-wise is because there's software, their cost related to the software for quantitative and qualitative work, we're looking at actually just having 1 or 2 research laptops. So people can use those, they'll book them out for a few days, do the part they need to do, export the data when they're ready to do some analysis and writing up, and then other people can use it as well. Because a license for SPSS right now, I think, is $1,000 a year. Is it $200 a year? Yeah. Okay. Atlas TI is, unless you're a student, is about $500 qualitative. So this is one that trips up people all the time, is having at least trying to identify some resources that you can have available if you need to have data entry, if you have massive surveys that need to be entered, although more and more people are doing online surveys, which addresses that, or if you have data that needs to be transcribed. Because if you're still working within the off the side of your desk paradigm, transcription of qualitative data is going to kill every single project you want to do. It will kill it. It will not go forward 99 times out of 100 because of people just don't, it's the last thing people want to do if they have to do this as an add-on. It's just tedious work. So try to build that in. And once you get the point where you're writing actually a detailed proposal, also develop a detailed project plan. What are the phases of the study? What are the things that have to happen in each phase? What's the proposed timing for each of those phases to length? What length are they? They can always change and evolve over time. It's not like you're making a contract. But by thinking about how long things are going to take, you have an idea of how long they can take. And you can see how well they track. And if this one goes reasonably well, when you want to do the next one and someone's talking about it, you can say, just so you know, we thought the data collection would be 2 months. It ended up being 8. It probably could have been 4 if we understood a few things, and this is what we didn't understand. But by making it a project plan, you're also, when you need to talk to people about what you're doing with your time, you can say, well, this is what phase we're on this CTAL project. So this is what we're doing right now. So some of the things that we're doing at CTLT as well is we've set up an intranet for people to share materials if they're working on or interested in CTAL projects. And everybody who's a staff person at CTLT has access to the site if they want. We use the UBC blog platform. For people who aren't aware of it, you can set up a UBC blog that is only available to people who you give access to that blog. You can use it as a mini intranet. We do that in a lot of projects here at UBC. So we have a website. So if someone has a version of a paper they're working on, they can post a version of that paper, and people who subscribe to the RSS feed of that site know that it's there. Or they can send an email to people saying, hey, I've got a draft of a paper up on the CTAL site. Can you take a look at it? If people could take a look at it and give me some feedback at a high level, I'd appreciate it. It saves you sending out an email to 78 people or 200. We do offer workshops. Mostly they're formative in terms of people talking about their ideas and workshopping them, but we're also looking at possibly doing some stuff about methodology, data management, data analysis. We're focusing on building and expanding our collegial mentoring process. So that's where the capacity, again, is really important. So when someone talks to you about a particular research study and you know someone else has some experience that bears on it, say, cool, you should talk to so-and-so, go down the hall. Or going down with the hall with them is even better. And then when we get to the point where we're having to manage the proposal stage of multiple projects is we're starting to discuss about what would an internal peer review system look like. Who would be involved, how many reviews, what are the time frames, what are the formats. A little forethought on something like that saves a lot of heartache for everybody.